Chapter 3. The Border. She was late to her own briefing. Not by intention. She had fallen asleep at the writing table somewhere around the third hour before dawn, cheek on the open border records, and woken to grey morning light with a crick in her neck and ink on her face and absolutely no regret about either. She had read 60 years of records. She had found 3 anomalies. She considered that a productive night. She washed her face, changed into the plainest thing she had packed, dark wool, high collar, practical, and was at Erevan's study door 11 minutes after the hour she had been told. The door was already open. He was already seated. He looked up when she entered and took in her appearance with one efficient sweep that she suspected catalogued the ink she had not fully removed from her jaw, the dark under her eyes, and the fact that she had dressed for function rather than the careful self-presentation she'd maintained yesterday. He said nothing about any of it. "Sit," he said, and returned to the document he'd been reading. She sat, and looked around while he finished. His study was the inverse of the one he'd given her, where hers was full, stacked, layered with accumulated knowledge. His was spare to the point of austerity. 1 desk, 2 chairs, a single shelf of books on the far wall, each one exactly spaced. A map of the Thornwood territory pinned at precise angles. No ornamentation, no personal objects visible except a single worn leather cord on the desk that he moved aside when he set down his document, quickly, like he'd forgotten it was there. She filed that away. "The terms," he said, and began. He was a thorough briefer. She gave him that. He covered her movement restrictions, outer ward freely, inner ward accompanied, the lower archive by request, the border road not at all, her communication protocols, the conditions under which the exchange would be dissolved. His voice was level throughout, the tone of someone reciting policy rather than negotiating it, and she listened without interrupting because interrupting would signal that she found the terms negotiable, and she wanted him to finish before she decided which ones she did. When he stopped, there was a silence. "The lower archive," she said. "By request to whom?" "To me. And if you're unavailable, Thessaly." And the response time on such requests. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "Within a day. That's a wide window." She kept her voice even, matching his register. "I'd like to propose within the hour, where possible. I'm conducting my own investigation." "You are not conducting an investigation. I found 3 anomalies in the border records last night," she said. "Just in the last 60 years. Gaps, places where entries stop abruptly and resume 2 weeks later with no notation. Twice before significant political events. Once, interestingly, 11 months before the vows tree was planted." She let that sit. "Tell me that's not relevant and I'll stop asking about the archive." Erevan looked at her. The grey-green of his eyes, she was learning, was a map she could read if she watched for long enough. Right now it was doing the thing it had done at the way station, that careful absorption of new information, the rapid recalculation that he performed without letting it reach his face, except that it always reached his eyes, and she was beginning to think he didn't know that. "Where in the records?" he said. "Volume 3, pages 40 through 46. Volume 7, pages 212 through 219. And Volume 1, your oldest and most deteriorated, a section that I can only read partially, but which seems to concern the original signatories of the vow." She paused. "Specifically, it concerns a 3rd signatory, one who isn't mentioned anywhere else." The silence this time was different, heavier. "Where did you read that?" Erevan said. His voice had not changed pitch or volume, but something in it had gone very, very still. "Volume 1, I said. Volume 1 is not in your quarters." "It was." Thessaly brought the archive collection and Volume 1 was. Saoirse stopped. Replayed this. Looked at his face. "It wasn't supposed to be there." "No," he said. "It was not. A beat. Someone put it there," she said. "Yes, someone who knew I'd read it. It would appear so." He stood. The motion was controlled but immediate, a soldier's movement. When something changes, you reassess position. He went to the door of his study, looked out into the corridor, came back. His expression had not fractured but it had sharpened, all the spare neutrality focusing into something colder and more alert. "Do you have the volume?" "It's on my desk." "Don't touch it again until I've—" He stopped, looked at her, made some decision. "Come with me." She had expected the archivist to be in the lower archive. The lower archive was, logically, where archives lived. She had pictured it while reading last night, a deep room, cool and dry, lined with the particular solemn silence of old paper. She had been looking forward to it in the way she looked forward to most libraries, which was to say with a feeling that was embarrassingly close to joy. The archivist was not in the lower archive. The archivist was in a room near the top of the Citadel's northern tower that could only be reached by a staircase so narrow that Saoirse and Erevan had to climb it single file, and which smelled of old cedar and something sweeter underneath, like dried flowers, like something that had been burning very slowly for a very long time. The room at the top was circular. Every wall was covered in text, not books, but inscribed directly into the stone, thousands of lines of Sylvain script in a dozen different hands, layered over centuries, some sections so old the characters were more eroded suggestion than legible word. In the center, in a chair that had been repaired so many times it was more repair than original chair, sat a person who was reading a book held very close to their face and did not look up when they entered. "Erevan," said the archivist. The voice was dry and unhurried and ageless in the way of things that have long since stopped counting years. "And the human girl." "Saoirse," Saoirse said, because she had decided this already about herself. The archivist looked up. Their eyes were the palest color she had ever seen in any living face, almost white, the iris barely distinguishable from the sclera, giving the impression of someone who looked at everything simultaneously and from a great distance. Their face was deeply lined but held so still it suggested the lines were not from age so much as accumulated precision. "Saoirse," the archivist repeated. The way they said it sounded like they were reading the word rather than speaking it. "Yes. You found the volume." "Someone left it in my quarters," she said. "Yes. Was it you?" A pause, long enough to be interesting. "Sit," the archivist said, the way very old people suggest things that are not actually suggestions. Saoirse sat. Erevan remained standing, which she suspected was habitual. "The third signatory," the archivist said, setting down the book with the deliberateness of someone who has thought very hard about the order in which to say things. "You read the passage." "Most of it. The deterioration made sections." "You read enough." They folded their hands, looked at her with those pale, all-encompassing eyes. The vow of ash was sealed by 3 parties, not 2. The throne of embers, the Sylvain Council, and a third power, older than either, older than this territory's current borders, which acted as the Covenant's anchor. Its guarantor. A pause. "It is not recorded in the public treaty because the third party requested to be left out of written history. They had reasons." "What reasons?" "Because recording their existence would have made them a target." The archivist's gaze was steady. The third signatory was not a nation, not a council. It was a bloodline. A family that carried an old magic, the magic of living things, of roots and growth and the covenant between the earth and those who stand on it. The same magic that made the vows tree possible. Without their blood in the ceiling, the covenant could not have held. Something was happening in Saoirse's chest. The resonance, stronger now than it had ever been, louder, almost legible. "That bloodline," she said, and her voice came out very even, very controlled, because she was her father's daughter in at least this way, she could put iron in her spine when everything else was going soft. "What happened to it?" "It dispersed," the archivist said. "Over centuries. Marriages into human courts. Children who didn't know what they carried. The magic going dormant, generation by generation, until it was thin enough to be invisible." Their pale eyes did not leave her face. "Until something woke it. Something like a murdered covenant tree. Something exactly like that, yes." The archivist tilted their head. "You've been feeling it, since you crossed the border." It was not a question. Saoirse looked at Erevan. He was looking at her, not with the brisk cataloguing she'd gotten used to, but with something she could not name, something with depth and care in it that he was visibly not permitting himself to let fully onto his face. His jaw was set, his eyes were a stormy dark green, the darkest she'd seen them. He had known this was coming. He had known, and he had let the archivist say it, because he had decided this was not his to say. She found she didn't know whether she was grateful or furious. She filed that too. There would be time to decide later. My mother, she said. Her mother's mother's mother, the archivist said. 5 generations back, a woman who left the Sylvain territories for the eastern coast and married into a minor human noble family and kept no records of what she was. Because recording it would make her a target. The same reason, yes. The room was very quiet. Saoirse was aware of her own breathing, in and out. The resonance in her chest was now so loud it felt structural, like a bell that had been rung and was still singing. So when the tree died, she said slowly, working through it, each piece clicking into the next with the horrible elegance of something that was designed, planned, the covenant began to unravel. And a covenant that has unraveled needs its original magic to be resealed. Which means the third bloodline needs to be present. Which means someone who knew this needed to find the last living descendant and bring them to the Thornwood. She looked at Erevan, and the easiest way to do that was to engineer a political crisis requiring a hostage exchange. A pause, thick and charged. The person who killed the tree, Erevan said. His voice was careful and tight. Did not do it to start a war. They did it to bring me here, Saoirse said. He met her eyes. Yes, and we don't know if that's because they want to use me to reseal the covenant. She held his gaze, making herself stay with the full shape of it. Or because they want to make sure I can't. The archivist picked up their book again. Now, they said, with the mild satisfaction of someone who has delivered a very complex message and found the recipient sufficiently intelligent to receive it, you understand why Volume 1 was not supposed to be in your quarters. Someone wanted you to find it before we could decide how to tell you. Someone who knew you would read it. A glance at Erevan. Someone inside the citadel. Erevan's expression did not change. Saoirse watched him, and saw, very briefly, too controlled to last more than a second, something that looked almost like pain. He knows who it is, she thought. He has known for longer than any of this. She did not say it. Not yet. She filed it in the place she kept the things she was not ready to use and turned back to the archivist and said, with iron in her voice and a very careful set to her jaw, what do I need to learn to do? The archivist looked at her for a moment with those pale, measuring eyes. Then, for the first time, they smiled. Erevan walked her back through the narrow staircase and along the upper corridor in silence. She let the silence run for a while. She was thinking, reorganizing everything, slotting each new fact into the architecture of her understanding and rebuilding the structure around it. It was not unlike what she'd been doing her whole life, taking the world as she found it and making it make sense, regardless of how much sense it wanted to make. Her blood was older than the treaty. Her blood was the reason the treaty existed. Someone had murdered 300 years of peace to get her here, and the only question left about why was whether they wanted her alive or otherwise. She found she was less frightened than she expected. More angry. The anger was useful, so she kept it. You knew, she said, when they reached the corridor outside her quarters. Erevan stopped. She stopped. They stood in the narrow stone corridor in the morning light that came through the arrow-slit windows in pale diagonal bars, and she looked at him directly, and waited. I suspected, he said, when I saw you at the negotiations. He stopped. Something moved through his face that she hadn't seen before, something unguarded enough that it was clearly involuntary. There's a quality to it. The old blood. It's detectable, to Sylvain, if you know what to look for. Do all of you know, or just you and Thessaly and the archivist? Just us. I ensured it. She registered this. Why? Because until I knew the shape of the situation, I wasn't going to let it become currency for anyone else. He paused. Your secret. Your choice of what to do with it. Something shifted in her chest. Not the resonance, something quieter, more human, more dangerous. She pressed it down. And the person inside the citadel. The one who left volume 1 in my quarters. His jaw set. That small tell. You know who it is, she said. Saoirse, don't. She kept her voice quiet. She was not, she decided, going to be angry at him for this yet, because the truth was she was barely keeping up with the last hour's revelations and she needed him functional. I'm not asking you to tell me now. I'm telling you that I know you know. And that at some point, soon, you are going to have to decide whether you are protecting someone who deserves it, or protecting someone who has been using your protection to get to me. He looked at her. The gray-green of his eyes was very dark, the color they went, she was learning, when he was feeling something he was actively refusing to let himself feel. He was very close in the narrow corridor, closer than they'd stood before, and she was acutely, unhelpfully aware of the specific quality of his stillness, the way it had tension in it rather than absence. I know, he said. Quietly. I know. A beat, too. She became aware of something. His hand, hanging at his side, had closed and then very deliberately opened again. As though he had been about to, reach for something, and had caught himself. She looked up at him and he looked down at her and neither of them moved. Then, from somewhere below them, a horn sounded. 3 short blasts, then a long one. Erevan turned immediately, the moment dissolving, soldier overriding everything else. Stay here, he said, already moving. What's the signal? She called after him. He paused, just briefly. Border alarm. Someone has crossed the Thornwood's outer wards. From the human side. Yes, she thought of Caden. She thought of her father. She thought of the person inside the citadel who had put a book in her room and the person outside who had planned her arrival for reasons that had not yet shown their full shape. Erevan. He stopped. She held his gaze. When you find out who crossed, tell me. Even if the protocol says not to. He looked at her for one long moment. Then, don't leave this corridor. Which, she noted, was not a no. She watched him go, quick, purposeful, the cloak sweeping behind him, and stood in the corridor in the pale morning light, with ancient blood humming in her chest and a dozen new edges to all her questions, and thought, whoever crossed that border came here knowing I'm inside this citadel. Which means they came here because of me. Which means it's starting. Below, the horn sounded again. Urgent. Closer. She stayed in the corridor exactly as long as it took her to conclude that staying was tactically useless. Then she went to find out what was coming. End of chapter 3.